So we move now on to medicines. We can forget antibiotics, any concepts of sterilisation, probably apart from putting a knife into a flame prior to cauterising cuts. There was no antiseptics, except possibly the use of lime for victims of plague, but equally burning would be more effective. Any medicines, drugs and preparations available to the medics of the time in 1700 had changed very little, if at all, over 1,000 years. In fact, they were dealing with medicine as proposed by Hippocrates and Galen and his 4 humours, which dated from the 1st and 2nd centuries. These humours were meant to be kept in balance, and I've listed here the 4 humours and what they were meant to represent. But equally, some medicines were described by their colour, their quality or their form, such as red roses and sandalwood for treating blood disorders, and saffron and rhubarb for treating liver disease. Anything heart-shaped, such as digitalis or foxglove for heart conditions. Galen had also postulated that drugs could be categorised as either hot or cold, moist or dry. And these unscientific theories as a collective would contribute to an excessive use of purgatives, sudorifics that cause sweating, emetics for making you sick, enemas which make the bowels open, bloodletting. All of these meant to rid the body of any malevolent humours and bring the humours back into balance. These compound drugs sometimes had over 50 ingredients, which is a bit of an indication that they weren't really sure what they were for. Nobody could decide what part of this group of products in these compound medicines actually did anything. There was no ability to investigate this. And the bottom line is that these compound medicines show the inadequacy of medicines at this time, when in effect pathological microorganisms still held absolute sway over men's bodies. In other words, as we've said before, your immune system is what determined in effect how long you might live or whether you could fight off infection. So much adulteration, that is adding things to these preparations, was common, and in effect it's a bit like the modern illicit street drugs, where in pure heroin might then be cut with a variety of compounds, some of which are even more harmful than the heroin that the individual would want to get the benefit from as they see it. Further to the use of animal preparations and human body parts and secretions, it was a bit of an ancient view that the cure for human ailments came from within. Thankfully, the last of the human products was deleted in 1746 from the London Pharmacopoeia. By that time, 75% of the preparations in the Pharmacopoeia were actually of vegetable or marine origin, and there'd be also 1 or 2 inorganic salts, metals, many of which later did lose popularity based on scientific evidence. In terms of where these drugs came from, a lot of the drugs, you could include spices in that, came to Hull from the Mediterranean, but not directly. It was usually via Holland and London, coastal trade with London. And then we also got stuff from the West Indies, but that was almost exclusively via London and the coastal trade. In the probate inventories, I rarely found any finished medicinal products mentioned, and that could be accounted for the fact that most of these were usually given to the patient as a single dose from a bulk supply, and therefore individual value would be incredibly low. Going back to the animal products, we still incorporate some animal products into modern medicine. For instance, we do now have medicinal leeches, occasionally maggots as well to remove dead flesh. We also, for instance, utilise honey in dressings to treat various infections of the skin. So some of the things have found new uses in the 21st century that we once thought were of no value. So here we have a list of the medical professions of the day, and the top of the tree are the physicians, followed by the apothecaries. And we've got a range of other people who dabbled in either providing medical advice and or providing medicines, the crude medicines that we've already described. And we'll go through these one at a time to give you an idea of what you had to do to become one of these people, and eventually we'll talk about their role in society. So the physicians, now these were the elite doctors of the day. They're equivalent, I guess, to 21st century consultants. You could only be a physician by obtaining a Master or Bachelor of Medicine from a university. In the UK, we had Oxford and Cambridge, Dublin, Edinburgh, and one or two European universities provided physicians such as Leiden and Reims. There was another opportunity of becoming a physician by what was termed licenses to practice. And in effect, any English university could allow any graduate in any subject, usually theology, mind you, to practice as a physician. And then we also had a rather unusual act from 1512 in Henry VIII's time that allowed bishops to examine and issue licenses if they deemed someone fit to practice medicine. However, by 1518, the College of Physicians began and started to regulate London practitioners, and this was later extended across the whole of England. However, in Yorkshire, the ecclesiastical control existed until around 1720. Physicians were, like, as I said, the consultants. They diagnosed illness and prescribed medicines for the apothecaries to dispense. They could also refer patients to surgeons, although surgery was very crude and often dangerous at this time. They were often accused of prescribing without actually seeing the patient, particularly during epidemics of infectious diseases. Physicians knew that diseases spread by contact or close proximity. What they didn't know was why or by what process. Robert Ganton was probably the most famous of the Hull physicians around that period, 1690 to 1710. He actually had qualified by apprenticeship as an apothecary. However, in 1690, he was granted license to practice medicines from the London College of Physicians. But interestingly, all of his apprentices qualified as apothecaries rather than physicians. He'd become quite influential, and clearly at the time of his death quite young. He was also quite benevolent. There are references to Robert Ganton practicing in Hull in the inventories of various local people. When Marshal Ripley died, he was described as a gentleman, and he owed a debt to Mr. Robert Ganton of 8 shillings and 10 pence. And a tailor, Samuel Jagger, owed Mr. Ganton £1. Dr. Briggs, now he's referenced on a couple of occasions in Hull probate inventories due to Dr. Briggs, the deceased physician, in his sickness, the sum of £2.10. And a couple of other physicians are mentioned by Bickford in their tome on the Hull medics across the centuries. Dr. Findlay, however, couldn't find any references in the inventories. Dr. James Clark, he was mentioned, and he did secure his freedom of Hull by buying it in 1698. The last man mentioned here, David Dunster, a bit of an enigma. I found his will. He died in Hull in 1696 and described himself as a physician, but he was actually born in Cambridge, New England, now Massachusetts, and he wasn't mentioned by Bickford, but I believe he will be the subject of another talk in the future. The second group of medics around in the late 17th century were the apothecaries, and this included the chemists and druggists as well. These men qualified by apprenticeship to a master apothecary, and in Hull many examples exist. In effect, many of them were shopkeepers that diverted into selling of therapeutic compounds, then dispensing physicians' prescriptions, but they also sold herbs, spices and a range of other products as well. They'd had the right to practice certain medicine from an act of Henry VIII in 1543. However, that led to a constant sort of battle with the physicians. They were always at loggerheads with the rights and so on of the two groups of professionals. By 1703, this had come to a bit of a head, and the Royal College of Physicians took a William Rose to court for prescribing medicine, and he was fined £70 because he was not a member of the Royal College. This was a vast sum in those days. The Society of Apothecaries appealed to the House of Lords, who then reversed the decision, stating it was not only contrary to custom, but also against public interest to prevent the giving of advice and treatment by apothecaries. So from then on, we ended up with these groups of apothecaries, some of whom continued to dispense physicians' prescriptions and sold the raw materials and official pharmacopoeia products. And then you had those who dabbled in the practice of physic or medicine. So the first group, actually, by 1841, had become the modern pharmacists, and the second group, earlier in the 19th century, had become the modern general practitioners. There are several references in the Hull probate inventories in the debts owed by the deceased for services provided by local apothecaries, and these are just some examples. And it was also noted in 1702 that chemists who have assumed so great a share of the apothecary art, it appears that some apothecaries were so intent on practicing medicine that they were actually neglecting their calling, which did require them to be in attendance, whereas physicians, of course, if you remember, often didn't see the patients. They simply prescribed for the apothecaries to dispense. In terms of value of the apothecaries' probate inventories, William Watson of Hull had drugs, medicines, utensils and books of physic valued at £64, 13 and 4. Now that compared quite favourably with a John Mayotte of Abingdon, who died in 1686 with shop stock of £46, 12 and 11 pence, and that of Nicholas Cook of Barnstable with shop stock of only £15 at that time. This slide depicts the apprentices of a Hull apothecary in the form of a family tree, and it starts with James Best and covers over 100 years. Many of these men went on to become aldermen, chamberlains, sheriffs and mayors. As you can see, Best had Alderman Christopher Richardson as his apprentice, and one of Richardson's apprentices was Robert Ganson, who became a physician, who we've already alluded to. Similarly, I've mentioned William Watson, one of Ganson's apprentices, in the previous slide, and to the left of Watson we have Wade, who was mentioned in one of the probate inventories of a Hull man. What we have here are two coats of arms of, on the left, the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, and on the right, the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries. And as you can see, they are ancient in their styling. They include things like mortars and pestle. serpents entwined around staffs, Apollo, the inventor of physic, unicorns, aloe there, and the figure on the right hand side of the coat of arms of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society is Gallon, all ancient symbols of the practice of medicine in different ways. Here we have the shop front of an apothecary down Tolgavel in Beverley. Still exists today, and as you can see, it's now the EE mobile phone shop. But you can see the serpents curled around, in effect, the staff, representing medicine, the practice of medicine. Here we have a 17th century apothecary shop. The nearest you'll probably find in our area to this would be in the Street Life Museum in Hull, where the Castello pharmacy was transported, literally lock, stock and barrel, from Leeds to Hull several years ago. And it's worth going to see what a 19th century pharmacy would look like, which probably isn't that dissimilar from a late 17th century apothecary shop. Most of the retail shops in Hull by the late 18th century would have been made of brick. They probably had a swinging sign above the door, possibly carrying a model pot mortar and pestle in gilt above the porch. Sometimes the shop fronts had serpents carved onto the frames, as we've seen from Beverley. But still relics of the past. And the shelves would be full of majolica drug pots, often continental, but usually English blue and white ceramics. The will of John Mayor of Abingdon in 1696 described a counter of mahogany or oak, nests of drug drawers and boxes for dried vegetable material, or wainscot boxes for bulk drugs, scales and weights, pewter measures, brass and bell metal mortars for heavy work, black mortars for hard lignum vitae, etc., etc. And further to the previous slide and description, and James Mayotts of Abingdon may well have had these kind of beautiful pots to hold the crude drugs and sometimes the finished products, like unguentum on the right means ointment.